Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Ireland. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time when you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. On the morning of April 2nd, 1878, a farmer traveling the remote road near Cratlock Wood in County Donegal came upon a scene of carnage that would send shockwaves through the British Empire. There, in a pool of blood beside his overturned carriage, lay the body of William Sidney Clements, the third Earl of Leitrim, one of the wealthiest and most powerful landowners in Ireland. His clerk and driver lay dead nearby, cut down alongside their master in an ambush of devastating precision. Within hours, telegraph wires carried the news to Dublin and London, where the establishment reacted with outrage and demands for swift justice. Yet in the villages and townland surrounding the scene, in the cottages of County Donegal and across the Earl's vast estates in Leitrim and Galway, the reaction was markedly different. There, the news was met with silence, and behind that silence, with something approaching satisfaction. The Freeman's Journal and the Irish Times published urgent reports demanding the apprehension of the assassins, while noting with unease that no witnesses had come forward despite the attack occurring in broad daylight on a public road. This was no ordinary murder, no crime of passion or robbery gone wrong. This was the culmination of decades of terror inflicted by a man whose name had become synonymous with cruelty, eviction, and exploitation. What follows is a documented account assembled from estate records, court testimonies, newspaper archives, Royal Irish Constabulary reports, and personal correspondence preserved in archives across Ireland and Britain. These records reveal how one man's tyranny over thousands of tenant families created such burning hatred that his assassination was met not with horror, but with quiet celebration. This is the story of how the third Earl of Leitrim became the most hated landlord in Ireland, and how that hatred followed him to his violent end on a lonely Donegal road. The Clements family rose to prominence during one of the darkest periods in Irish history, when the penal laws systematically stripped Catholics of their lands and transferred vast estates to Protestant families loyal to the British Crown. Records preserved in the Registry of Deeds in Dublin trace the family's accumulation of property beginning in the late 17th century, when the first Clements to settle in Ireland received crown grants for service to William of Orange. Through subsequent generations, the family expanded their holdings through strategic marriages to other ascendancy families, and through purchases of confiscated Catholic lands sold at auction for a fraction of their value. By the early 19th century, the Clements controlled over 90,000 acres spread across counties Leitrim, Donegal, and Galway, making them one of the largest landholding families in the west of Ireland. The family seat at Loughrinn in County Leitrim stood as a monument to their wealth and power. Contemporary visitors described a grand estate house surrounded by manicured gardens and productive farmland, all maintained by tenant labor. Yet these same accounts noted the stark contrast between the manor's opulence and the desperate poverty of the tenant cottages that dotted the surrounding hills. Under the landlord system that governed rural Ireland, tenants held no legal rights to the land they worked. They could be evicted at will, their rents raised without limit, their homes demolished at the landlord's pleasure. The relationship between landlord and tenant was one of absolute power on one side and complete vulnerability on the other. Into this system, William Sidney Clements was born in 1806, the eldest son of the second Earl. He pursued a military career in his youth, serving in the British Army and later in the Royal Navy, where he developed the rigid discipline and authoritarian temperament that would characterize his later rule over his estates. When his father died in 1854, William inherited the title, the lands, and the thousands of tenant families whose lives now rested entirely in his hands. He was 48 years old, unmarried, and possessed of a character that would soon make him the most feared man in 3 counties. Those who knew William Sidney Clements described a man of contradictions, possessed of enormous wealth yet miserly in its expenditure, holding absolute power, yet consumed by the need to control every minor detail of his domains. Contemporary accounts from servants, tenants, and even fellow members of the aristocracy paint a portrait of a landlord unlike any other in Ireland. Where most landowners of his class preferred the comforts of Dublin or London, leaving their estates to be managed by agents, the Earl insisted on personal involvement in every aspect of his properties. Letters preserved in the National Library of Ireland reveal his meticulous nature, with detailed instructions regarding tenant arrangements, rent collection schedules, and property improvements, all written in his own hand. No decision was too small to escape his attention, no tenant too insignificant to avoid his direct scrutiny. Servants at Leitrim spoke of his violent temper, his sudden rages over minor infractions, and the atmosphere of fear that pervaded the household. He never married, and rumors circulated among the gentry regarding his reasons for remaining a bachelor, whispers about his preferences and proclivities that polite society declined to discuss openly. His isolation from his peers was nearly complete. He rarely entertained, seldom attended social functions, and was known to treat even fellow aristocrats with cold disdain. Yet, it was his behavior toward female tenants that generated the darkest accounts. Petitions preserved in Dublin Castle archives contained complaints from families whose daughters had attracted the Earl's attention, complaints that were systematically ignored by authorities unwilling to challenge a peer of the realm. Specific incidents were recorded, young women summoned to Leitrim on pretexts, visits to tenant holdings that left families shaken and silent. Those who spoke of these matters risked immediate eviction, and so most chose silence, nursing their grievances in private while the Earl continued his predations unchecked. His miserliness was legendary, despite his enormous income. He haggled over pennies with merchants, denied requests for basic repairs to tenant dwellings, and accumulated wealth that sat unused while his tenants struggled to survive. This combination of tight control, violent temper, and predatory behavior created a tyranny more oppressive than any absentee landlord could have imposed. Shortly after assuming full control of his estates, the Earl embarked on a campaign of evictions that would devastate communities across 3 counties and earn him a reputation unmatched in the annals of Irish landlordism. Estate records preserved in the Representative Church Body Library document the systematic clearance of entire townlands during the late 1852 and throughout the 1860s, as the Earl consolidated small holdings into larger grazing farms that required fewer tenants and generated greater profits. The scale was staggering. Testimony given to later government inquiries and preserved in parliamentary papers establishes that the Earl evicted more tenants than any other landlord in Connacht during this period, with estimates ranging into the thousands of individuals expelled from lands their families had worked for generations. The process of eviction followed a grim routine documented in contemporary newspaper accounts and illustrations. The sheriff would arrive, accompanied by constables and a crew of men armed with crowbars and battering rams. Families were given minutes to gather what possessions they could carry before being forced from their homes. Then came the tumbling, the systematic destruction of the cottage to prevent reoccupation, walls knocked down, roof timbers pulled away, the hearth where generations had gathered reduced to rubble. Families stood in fields watching their homes destroyed, their children crying, their elderly parents bewildered, with nowhere to go and no recourse to law. Some were offered what the Earl termed assisted emigration, passage to America paid from estate funds. Shipping records from New York and Boston show hundreds of families from the Leitrim estates arriving during these years, deposited in a foreign land with nothing but the clothes they wore and memories of the homes they had lost. Descendants of these immigrants preserved family stories of their expulsion, accounts passed down through generations that burned with undiminished anger. Those who remained in Ireland faced the workhouse, the roads, or the charity of neighbors scarcely better off than themselves. The Earl watched these clearances with satisfaction, recording increased rental income in his ledgers, while the human wreckage of his policies scattered across 2 continents. To him, these were necessary improvements. To his tenants, they were acts of war. The evictions and rent increases alone would have made the Earl despised, but it was another aspect of his tyranny that transformed hatred into something deeper and more dangerous. Persistent allegations followed him throughout his decades of rule, accusations that he systematically exploited female tenants, using his absolute power over their families to coerce their compliance. Sworn depositions collected during various investigations and petitions sent to Dublin Castle document a pattern of predatory behavior spanning from the 1,850 until his death. Young women from tenant families were summoned to Lough on various pretexts: to discuss their family's rent, to seek permission for a marriage, to request repairs to their dwelling. Some returned home in silence, refusing to speak of what had occurred. Others never returned at all, sent away to distant relatives or to institutions for unwed mothers in Dublin and Cork. The Earl's inspections of tenant holdings took on a sinister character, with families hiding their daughters when word spread that he was traveling through the district. Those who refused his advances, or who spoke publicly of his behavior, faced immediate consequences. Eviction notices arrived within days, families cast out with no explanation beyond the landlord's displeasure. This pattern of retaliation ensured silence, as families weighed their daughter's violation against the loss of their home and livelihood. Contemporary letters between clergy members preserved in diocesan archives express coded concern about conditions on the estates, references to the moral welfare of young women, and the abuse of authority that canon law forbade them from addressing directly. Newspaper articles occasionally hinted at improprieties, veiled references to the Earl's character that readers understood, but that provided no grounds for legal action. The social and legal systems of the time made it impossible for a tenant to successfully accuse an earl of assault. No court would credit such testimony, no jury would convict, and the accuser would face certain ruin. And so the crimes continued, each violation adding to the reservoir of hatred that built across the estates. It was this aspect of his tyranny, more than the evictions or the raised rents, that made his eventual assassination not merely acceptable to his tenants, but righteous. The Earl's tyranny did not go unchallenged. Throughout his rule, resistance simmered across his estates, occasionally erupting into direct attempts on his life that he survived through luck, vigilance, and the protection of armed guards. Police reports preserved in the National Archives in Dublin detail a pattern of violence directed specifically at the Earl beginning shortly after he assumed control of his properties. In 1856, shots were fired at his carriage as he traveled near his Leitrim estates, the bullets passing close enough to splinter the wooden frame. In 1864, an attempted ambush near Mohill was thwarted only because the Earl had changed his route at the last moment, a habit of unpredictability he cultivated deliberately. Throughout the 1,860 seconds and 1,870 seconds, threatening letters arrived at Lough with regularity, promising death if he did not moderate his treatment of tenants or leave Ireland entirely. The Earl's response to these threats revealed much about his character. Rather than reconsidering his policies or seeking reconciliation with his tenants, he increased his personal security and continued his oppressive practices unchanged. His correspondence from this period shows a man contemptuous of those who opposed him, dismissing them as criminals and agitators unworthy of consideration. He traveled armed with pistols and a repeating rifle, employed armed guards to accompany him on his journeys, and varied his routes and schedules to frustrate those who might plan an attack. His testimony before parliamentary committees investigating Irish unrest demonstrated his complete dismissal of tenant grievances. He advocated harsh measures against resistance, more police, more soldiers, more severe punishments, never acknowledging that his own behavior might contribute to the unrest. Local resistance networks operated throughout the region during these decades. Agrarian secret societies, including the Ribbonmen, organized tenant opposition, while early Land League organizers began channeling anger into more structured political action. Yet for many who had suffered directly under the Earl's rule, political organization offered too slow a remedy. The conviction grew across the 3 counties that petitions and protests would never restrain a man so contemptuous of those beneath him. By the mid-1870s, many had concluded that only the Earl's death would bring relief to the suffering tenants of his estates. The Fanad Peninsula extends into the cold waters of the North Atlantic from the northern coast of County Donegal, a landscape of rocky hills, small farms, and scattered villages connected by narrow roads that turn to mud in the frequent rains. It was here, in one of the most isolated and impoverished corners of the Earl's vast holdings, that the conspiracy to end his life took shape. The region had a long history of resistance to outside authority, from the Gaelic chieftains who held out against English conquest to the tenant farmers who defied landlord agents and process servers. Census records from the 1872 reveal a population living at the margins of survival, families crowded into small holdings that could barely support them, dependent on potato crops and seasonal labor to meet their rents. The Earl's Donegal properties were managed with the same harsh efficiency as his Leitrim estates. Rent rolls preserved in estate archives show regular increases imposed on tenants who had no capacity to pay more, while eviction records document the removal of families who fell into arrears. Conditions in Fanad were particularly severe, with tenants paying higher rents per acre than those on comparable land elsewhere in the county. Church registers and later testimony established the network of families in the surrounding townlands of Carrow Trasna, Cratley, and Kilmacrenan, who had suffered directly from the Earl's policies. The year 1877 brought fresh grievances that inflamed local opinion to the breaking point. A series of evictions cleared several families from their holdings, while rent increases imposed that autumn pushed others to the edge of ruin. The Earl visited his Donegal properties regularly to inspect tenant holdings and conduct business, traveling with his clerk and staying at accommodations in Milford. During these visits, his behavior toward local families followed the pattern established elsewhere on his estates: imperious demands, threats of eviction, and attention to young women that left families shaken and angry. The roads he traveled became familiar to those who watched his movements, particularly the stretch through Cratley Wood, where the route narrowed between dense trees. By early 1878, the decision had been made. The Earl would not leave Donegal alive. The men who planned the Earl's assassination were not strangers or hired killers from distant places. They were local men, farmers and laborers from the townland surrounding Cratley Wood, men whose families had suffered under the Earl's rule and who had determined that his death was the only remedy for their grievances. Police investigations, later confessions, and deathbed statements that emerged over subsequent decades identified several individuals, though the full roster of those involved was never conclusively established. The conspiracy was protected by the same communal silence that would later frustrate investigators, and participants took their secrets to their graves or shared them only with trusted family members. Michael Herity was a young farmer from Carrow Trasna, whose family had experienced the Earl's cruelty directly. Parish records show his baptism in 1850, and land records indicate that his family held a small tenancy on the Earl's Donegal estates. Neil Shields came from the townland of Cratley itself, a man in his 30s whose knowledge of the local terrain would prove essential to the conspiracy. Michael McElwee, also from the immediate area, had witnessed evictions of neighboring families and had his own grievances against the landlord who controlled their lives. Testimony from neighbors collected during the investigation described these men as quiet, hard-working, and unremarkable, the sort who would never draw attention to themselves. The conspiracy formed gradually during the winter of 1877 and early months of 1878, coalescing around shared anger and a determination to act. Later accounts reconstructed the planning process, describing how the men studied the Earl's movements during his visits to Donegal, noting his routes, his schedules, and his habits. They acquired weapons, likely older firearms that could not be easily traced, and they selected the location for the ambush with care. The stretch of road through Cratley Wood offered ideal conditions, a narrow passage flanked by dense trees that would allow the attackers to approach unseen and escape into terrain they knew intimately. The exact number of participants remained uncertain, with estimates ranging from 3 to as many as 8 men involved in the actual attack or serving as lookouts on the surrounding roads. What is certain is that by late March 1878, the plan was complete and the conspirators were waiting only for the Earl's next visit to Donegal. The Earl arrived in Milford in late March 1878 to conduct his regular business on his Donegal estates, taking lodgings at his usual accommodations and summoning tenants to meet with him regarding rents, leases, and land matters. Estate records document these final days of activity, showing a man continuing his oppressive practices without any awareness that his death had already been decided. He met with tenants who came seeking reductions in rent or extensions on arrears, and by all accounts, he treated their requests with his customary dismissiveness. One tenant who met with him on March 30th later testified that the Earl had threatened eviction over a debt of less than £2, showing no mercy despite the family's desperate circumstances. Observations from servants and associates regarding his mood during these final days suggest nothing unusual. He was irritable, demanding, and meticulous as always, reviewing accounts and issuing instructions with the attention to detail that characterized his management. If he received any warnings about threats to his safety, he gave no indication of concern. His habit of traveling armed and varying his routes reflected a general caution rather than any specific intelligence about the conspiracy awaiting him. On the morning of April 2nd, the Earl prepared to depart Milford for the journey back to his seat at Leitrim in County Leitrim. His traveling party consisted of himself, his clerk, William Kincaid, and his driver, Charles Buchanan, both loyal employees who had served him for years. Kincaid, a man of approximately 50 years, handled correspondence and accounts during these inspection trips. Buchanan managed the horses and carriage with quiet competence. Neither man had any reason to suspect that accompanying the Earl on this journey would cost them their lives. The morning was cool and overcast, typical April weather for the region, with mist hanging in the hollows and visibility limited on the narrow roads. The route to Leitrim would take them south through Cratlack Wood, a stretch of road the Earl had traveled many times before. Staff at the Milford residence watched the carriage depart shortly after dawn, the Earl seated inside with his weapons close at hand, Kincaid beside him with the dispatch case containing estate documents. The carriage rounded the bend and disappeared from view, heading toward the wood where armed men waited in the trees. The attack came at approximately 7:30 in the morning as the Earl's carriage traveled the narrow road through Cratlack Wood. The exact sequence of events was reconstructed by investigators from physical evidence collected at the scene, post-mortem examinations of the 3 victims, and later testimony from those who claimed knowledge of what occurred. The location had been chosen with care, a stretch where the road passed between dense stands of trees that provided concealment and where the terrain would slow the carriage to walking pace. The assassins positioned themselves on both sides of the road, likely numbering between 4 and 6 men armed with shotguns and other firearms. As the carriage entered the kill zone, the attackers opened fire. The initial volley struck the driver Charles Buchanan, who fell from his seat mortally wounded. The horses reared in panic, and the carriage lurched to a stop. The Earl, reacting with the military training of his youth, seized his weapons and attempted to defend himself. He managed to discharge at least 1 shot before being struck multiple times. William Kincaid, unarmed and trapped in the carriage, was shot as he tried to flee or shield himself. The medical examiner's report documented the wounds on all 3 victims with clinical precision. Buchanan had been struck by multiple shotgun blasts to the upper body. Kincaid suffered gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen. The Earl himself bore the evidence of sustained attack, multiple gunshot wounds to the torso and head, along with additional injuries suggesting close-quarters violence after he had fallen. His skull showed fractures consistent with blows from a heavy instrument, indicating that the assassins had ensured he was dead before departing. The entire attack likely lasted less than 2 minutes. When it was over, the assassins disappeared into the woods they knew intimately, leaving behind 3 bodies, a blood-soaked carriage, and terrified horses straining against their harnesses. Documents from the Earl's dispatch case lay scattered on the road, stirred by the morning breeze. The most hated landlord in Ireland lay dead in the mud, his reign of terror ended by men whose names he had likely never bothered to learn. The silence of the wood settled over the scene, broken only by the calls of birds and the labored breathing of the dying horses. The bodies were discovered shortly after 8 o'clock that morning by a local man traveling the road toward Milford. His account, given at the inquest and preserved in official records, described the scene he encountered. The carriage stopped at an angle across the road, the horses still in their traces but wild-eyed and trembling, and 3 bodies lying in pools of blood that had begun to congeal in the cool morning air. He recognized the Earl immediately, having seen him pass through the district many times before. The man ran to the nearest dwelling to raise the alarm, and within the hour, constables from the Royal Irish Constabulary Station at Milford had arrived at the scene. Their initial observations, recorded in reports now held in the National Archives, noted the positions of the bodies, the spent cartridges scattered on the road, and the Earl's discharged weapons lying near his body. The news traveled swiftly through the channels of colonial authority. By midday, Dublin Castle had been informed by telegraph. By evening, London knew that one of Ireland's peers had been assassinated on a public road. The response from the British establishment was immediate and outraged. Newspapers, including the Times of London and the Irish Times, published urgent reports condemning the murders and demanding that the perpetrators be brought to justice. The Protestant ascendancy expressed shock that such violence could be visited upon one of their own, calling for increased military presence and harsher measures against Irish sedition. Yet in the villages and townlands surrounding Cratloe Wood, a different response prevailed. Contemporary observers remarked on the notable silence from the local Catholic population. There were no expressions of grief, no offers of assistance to investigators, no condemnation of the crime. When constables canvassed the area seeking witnesses, they encountered only shaking heads and claims of ignorance. Despite the attack occurring in daylight on a traveled road, not a single person admitted to seeing or hearing anything. The bodies were removed to Milford for post-mortem examination, and special investigators were summoned from Dublin to lead the inquiry. From the first hours, authorities confronted the challenge that would frustrate them for years. An entire community had closed ranks, and the wall of silence surrounding the assassins appeared unbreakable. The investigation into the Earl's assassination became one of the most intensive criminal inquiries in Irish history, with resources poured into the effort by authorities determined to bring the perpetrators to justice. Special investigators were dispatched from Dublin Castle to take charge of the case, working alongside Royal Irish Constabulary officers from the region. Their reports and correspondence, preserved in the National Archives, document a methodical investigation that pursued every available lead while confronting a community united in its refusal to cooperate. Constables conducted hundreds of interviews in the townlands surrounding Cratloe Wood, visiting every dwelling within miles of the ambush site. The results were uniform and frustrating. No one had seen the attackers. No one had heard the shots. No one had noticed anything unusual that morning. Farmers claimed to have been working in distant fields. Women said they had been occupied inside their cottages. Even those whose homes stood within earshot of the road professed complete ignorance of the events that had occurred. Investigators noted in their reports the impossibility of this collective blindness, yet they could not compel testimony that was not offered. Rewards for information were announced almost immediately and increased repeatedly as the investigation stalled. The final total exceeded £1,000, an enormous sum that would have represented a lifetime's income for any tenant farmer in Donegal. Yet not a single person came forward to claim it. The money sat untouched, a testament to the depth of hatred for the Earl and the strength of communal solidarity against the authorities who had protected him. Specific suspects were identified early based on local knowledge and the geography of the crime. Michael Herity, Neil Shields, and Michael McElwee were among those questioned, but each provided alibis that investigators could not definitively disprove. Searches of their homes yielded no weapons matching those used in the attack. The physical evidence collected at the scene, spent cartridges, wadding, and shot, indicated older firearms of common types that could not be traced to specific owners. The Earl's family pressed authorities relentlessly for results, their correspondents expressing frustration at the slow progress and demanding more vigorous measures. Yet, despite every effort, the investigation produced no actionable evidence. The assassins remained protected behind a wall of silence that no reward could breach and no threat could penetrate. Under intense pressure to produce results, authorities eventually made arrests despite the weakness of their evidence. Michael Harity, Neil Shields, and Michael McElwee were taken into custody based on circumstantial connections to the crime and the testimony of a single witness who claimed to have seen them near the ambush site on the morning of the assassination. The arrests were announced with confidence by officials eager to demonstrate that justice would be served, but the case that proceeded to trial revealed the fundamental impossibility of obtaining convictions when an entire community refused to cooperate with the prosecution. Court records from the proceedings document the charges brought against the accused and the evidence presented by the Crown. The prosecution relied heavily on the testimony of their key witness, a local man who claimed knowledge of the conspiracy and the identities of those involved. The defense challenged this testimony vigorously, questioning the witness's credibility and suggesting that his statements had been obtained through coercion or the promise of reward money. Character witnesses for the accused testified to their good reputations and peaceful dispositions, while alibis placed them elsewhere at the time of the attack. The prosecution's case collapsed when the key witness recanted his testimony, claiming that he had been pressured by authorities and that his statements were false. Without this evidence, the Crown had nothing but suspicion and circumstantial connections that fell far short of proof beyond reasonable doubt. The defendants were acquitted or had charges against them dismissed, walking free to return to their communities. The reaction from authorities was bitter. Official correspondence preserved in Dublin Castle archives expresses frustration with the Irish jury system and the impossibility of obtaining justice when local populations protected those accused of crimes against landlords. Some officials alleged that jurors had been intimidated or were themselves sympathetic to the assassins. Allegations also emerged regarding the treatment of suspects during detention, with claims that coercive methods had been employed to extract confessions that never came. The acquittals resolved nothing. They were not exonerations, but rather the successful operation of communal protection, a demonstration that the bonds of solidarity among the Earl's former tenants were stronger than the power of British law. The official record closed with no convictions, while in the townlands of Donegal, everyone knew exactly who had pulled the triggers at Cratloe Wood. The wall of silence that protected the Earl's assassins was not merely the absence of testimony, but an active, sustained effort by an entire community to shield the men who had done what so many had wished to do. This phenomenon drew comment from observers on both sides of the Irish question. British officials and ascendancy newspapers expressed outrage that no one would come forward despite the enormous rewards offered, interpreting this silence as evidence of the lawlessness and moral degradation of the Irish peasantry. Irish nationalists saw something quite different, a demonstration of communal solidarity against an oppressive system and a landlord whose crimes had forfeited any claim to justice. The social mechanisms enforcing this silence were powerful and deeply rooted. Informers in Ireland faced consequences far worse than ostracism. They and their families could expect to be shunned completely, denied assistance in times of need, excluded from markets and fairs, and subjected to violence. The memory of informers from earlier periods of resistance remained vivid, their names spoken with contempt generations after their betrayals. No reward, however substantial, could compensate for becoming an outcast in one's own community. Later accounts documented specific incidents where potential witnesses were pressured to maintain their silence. Those suspected of considering cooperation with authorities received visits from neighbors offering pointed reminders of community expectations. The Catholic Church occupied an ambiguous position. Priests were obligated to condemn violence from the pulpit, and many did so in terms that satisfied ecclesiastical requirements. Yet these same priests heard confessions and knew their parishioners intimately. They understood the suffering the Earl had inflicted and recognized that their congregations would never betray the assassins, regardless of official church teaching. The folk memory of the assassination kept the truth alive, even as the official record remained closed. Songs celebrating the deeds circulated through the district, naming no names but leaving no doubt about community sentiment. Stories passed from parents to children identified the men responsible and honored them as those who had delivered the people from a tyrant. This wall of silence held for decades, cracking only gradually as participants aged and felt the need to unburden themselves before death, sharing the truth with priests and family members who guarded it until the passage of time made disclosure safe. The full scope of the Earl's impact on the thousands of families who lived under his authority can only be understood by tracing the fates of those whose lives he destroyed. Emigration records from the ports of Derry, Sligo, and Dublin document the departure of hundreds of families from his estates, driven out by eviction or grinding poverty. Ship manifests show them arriving in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia with nothing but the clothes they wore, joining the masses of Irish poor struggling to survive in foreign cities. Workhouse registers from counties Leitrim, Donegal, and Galway record the names of those who had nowhere else to go after the tumbling crews demolished their homes, families broken apart by institutional rules that separated husbands from wives and parents from children. Descendants of evicted tenants preserved family stories of their expulsion, accounts that burned with anger, undimmed by generations. Estate records reveal the conditions his tenants endured and the wealth they generated for their landlord. Rent rolls show payments that consumed nearly the entire produce of small holdings, barely capable of supporting a family. The Earl's annual income from his properties exceeded £10,000, an enormous sum derived from the labor of people living in one-room cottages with dirt floors and no security of tenure. The disparity between his wealth and their poverty was absolute, yet he haggled over shillings and evicted families for minor arrears. The allegations of sexual predation left wounds that persisted for generations. Families who suffered the Earl's attention carried shame and trauma that affected descendants who learned the stories only in whispered fragments. Women who had been violated faced social stigma regardless of their innocence, while their families bore the knowledge that they had been powerless to protect them. Historians who have studied the Earl's behavior suggest explanations rooted in psychology, a need for absolute control, sadistic satisfaction in the exercise of power, perhaps darker compulsions that his position allowed him to indulge without consequence. Whatever drove his cruelty, its effects were devastating and lasting. For the communities that suffered under his rule, his assassination was not murder but justice finally delivered, the only remedy available to people who had no recourse to law and no protection from a system designed to serve their oppressor. The truth about the assassination at Cratloe Wood emerged gradually over subsequent decades, seeping out through deathbed confessions, immigrant letters, and family traditions that were eventually shared with historians. The official case remained unsolved, but the historical record grew steadily more complete as participants felt the approach of death and the need to unburden themselves of secrets held for a lifetime. Deathbed confessions documented by priests and family members provided the most direct accounts. Men who had maintained silence for decades spoke at last when they knew their time was short, some seeking absolution for the taking of life, others wishing to establish their role for posterity, still others simply releasing a burden they had carried too long. These confessions were guarded carefully by those who received them, shared only within trusted circles until the passage of time made wider disclosure safe. The accounts that emerged confirmed the identities of key participants while revealing details of the planning and execution that investigators had never uncovered. Letters sent by emigrants to family in Ireland provided additional pieces of the story. Some participants had left for America or Australia in the years following the assassination, whether to escape suspicion or simply seeking better opportunities. From the safety of distance, they occasionally wrote of their involvement in terms that families preserved and eventually shared with researchers. These letters describe the meetings where the conspiracy took shape, the acquisition of weapons, the selection of the ambush site, and the events of that April morning. Local historians and journalists began piecing together the full story in the 20th century, interviewing elderly residents who possessed knowledge passed down from participants and witnesses. These researchers found communities still protective of the assassin's memory, but increasingly willing to share information as living connections to the events faded. Discrepancies between various accounts complicated the picture. Participants remembered events differently, claimed different roles, or contradicted one another on specific details. Some accounts may have been embellished over years of retelling, while others were fragmentary, preserving only portions of what the speaker knew. The chapter of history that emerged was substantially complete, but acknowledged gaps that would never be filled. The official record closed with no convictions, but the historical record eventually captured the essential truth of what happened and why. The assassination of the Earl of Leitrim cannot be understood in isolation, but must be placed within the broader context of Irish history and the transformation of land ownership that would reshape Irish society in the decades that followed. Historians who have analyzed the case establish its significance as both a symbol of tenant resistance and an influence on subsequent events. The killing occurred just 2 years before the land war erupted across Ireland, a sustained campaign of resistance to landlordism that would ultimately dismantle the system under which the Earl had operated. The assassination and the failure to achieve convictions sent a powerful message to both landlords and British authorities. Landlord power, however absolute in law, could not be maintained when entire communities united in opposition. The Earl's fate demonstrated that even the most powerful could be brought down, and that the apparatus of British justice was helpless when confronted with communal solidarity. This lesson was not lost on those who would organize the Land League and pursue the campaign of boycotts and resistance that followed. The Land Acts of 1881 and subsequent reforms began the gradual transfer of land ownership from landlords to tenants, a process that would continue for decades until the old system was entirely dismantled. Historians debate the relative contributions of constitutional politics and violent resistance to these changes, but few deny that the threat of violence played a role in concentrating minds and creating urgency for reform. The Earl's assassination stood as a reminder of what happened to landlords who pushed their tenants beyond endurance. In nationalist memory, the Earl of Leitrim came to symbolize the worst excesses of the landlord system, and his assassination was celebrated as a blow against tyranny. Songs and stories kept the memory alive, honoring the men who had acted when others only complained. Unionist tradition viewed the case quite differently, as evidence of Irish lawlessness and ingratitude, a brutal murder that demonstrated why firm British rule remained necessary. These competing interpretations persist in historical writing, reflecting broader divisions in how Irish history is understood. The case remains relevant to understanding the relationship between colonial authority, resistance, and eventual political change, and a specific instance that illuminates larger patterns of oppression and the varied forms that opposition may take. The road through Cratloe Wood remains today much as it was on that April morning in 1878, a narrow passage through trees where a man who had terrorized thousands met his end. Visitors to County Donegal can still walk the route the Earl's carriage traveled, though no marker indicates the exact spot where the ambush occurred. The landscape has changed little. The same hills and hollows, the same quiet broken only by wind and bird song. At Lough Rinn, in County Leitrim, the Earl's former residence stands as a hotel, its grand rooms available to guests who may know nothing of the man who once ruled there with such cruelty. The graveyards of the region hold the remains of the principal figures, the Earl buried with his ancestors, his victims, and his assassins in the modest plots of their parishes. Local communities maintain the memory of the assassination through oral tradition passed down through generations. Elderly residents can still recount the stories they heard from grandparents who knew the participants or witnessed the aftermath. Historical plaques in the region acknowledge the events, and local historians continue to research and publish accounts that add detail to the record. The descendants of those involved have scattered across Ireland and the world, some aware of their connection to these events, and others having lost the thread of family history. Questions remain that will never be answered with certainty. The exact number of participants in the ambush, The full network of those who planned and supported the conspiracy, the locations where weapons were hidden and later disposed of, these details died with those who possessed them. Evidence has been lost to time, documents destroyed, memories faded beyond recovery. The case remains officially unsolved, though the historical consensus regarding responsibility is clear. The themes of the case resonate beyond its specific circumstances, speaking to the abuse of power, the limits of human endurance, and the complex morality of political violence. The Earl's assassination raises questions that admit no easy answers. Was it murder or justice? Did the ends justify the means? In the hills of Donegal and Leitrim, such questions matter less than the simple truth that a tyrant was stopped and a suffering people found relief. The story of the Earl of Leitrim remains alive in those communities, passed from generation to generation, a reminder that the sins of the powerful are neither forgotten nor forgiven.